Brad, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for coming on.
Excellent to be here. Thank you.
Welcome to Technosocial.
So we met a couple of weeks ago and started a kind of very interesting conversation about archetypes and the work that you're doing with archetypes. And I thought it would be great to invite you on and continue that. So perhaps you could just begin by introducing yourself and kind of talking a bit about what it is you do.
So to some, I'm known as a success coach. I essentially work with individuals, with teams, in order to help them to improve their performance in all kinds of ways. But I particularly have this model around the archetypes, as you mentioned, which would be great to unpack today. Essentially, we're saying, guys, what is it you're seeking to do? We set up measurements for their performance, and then we start looking at how they're behaving in the light of the goals that they're seeking to achieve. And then from that, we start saying, okay, what has to change? And that can happen at all sorts of levels, but what I've found over the years is that this archetypal model is one of the quickest ways of somebody changing the essential perspective of who they are, not so much what they do. And once they've shifted at that level of identity, then they're able to very naturally see what it is they need to do in the real world in terms of their behaviors.
So it's something kind of very deep about who you are, and I suppose the story you tell yourself about yourself.
It is. A story comes into it very much, and it is very deep. When I was first asked to present this, the big sort of first public time when this went out, I'd written a book in 2012 called Team Me, initially titled Using Archetypes to Get Out of Stuck, because I had this crazy theory, which I've never been able to disprove, that if you are stuck in any situation in life, it's simply because you haven't plugged into one of 6 archetypes and accessed their power, awakened their capabilities in that situation. And I keep saying that must not be true in some situation, but I haven't yet found a situation where that isn't true. Right? Sometimes the change is instant, but it depends on how much development work is necessary. It's like going to the gym. You can go to the gym and you can do any kind of workout. It will strengthen the muscles that you've got. There are some things that just very quickly you're suddenly able to do and a whole lot more. There's other things you just need to work at it, and then 6 months, a year later, you say, actually, that's now natural and easy for me. To start with, I felt sick doing that exercise. And it's similar with archetypes. You can build characteristics in yourself very easily if you put the effort into the program.
So what do we mean by an archetype? Because I think that's kind of where we should really start this conversation.
Yeah, as we've jumped in already, but the term, the etymology of archetype, so you've got the arc bit and you've got the type bit. Well, you've all used a typewriter, I presume, in some shape or form. Well, a typewriter creates type. The type is, unlike in the old days, it was handwriting, it was quills and it was pens, but everybody would do an F in a slightly different way. You'd recognize it, but it's slightly different. A typewriter was the first instrument that they had, where an individual, you had printing presses doing this before, but an individual could print a type, a form, a model, and it would stay that same shape, same size, same form every single time they hit the letter F, hit the letter A, it would be the same thing. So that it's the type, okay?
So
it is a like fixed form.
Standardization in a way.
It's a fixed form, which, for as many times as you replicate it, it's going to be fixed.
Okay, cool.
So that's the type bit. So we hear about stereotypes, we hear about typewriters, we've got all sorts of types appear in the world. So we're talking about a model. So an E-type Jaguar was, okay, we're now doing a different form of a Jaguar. We're going to call it E, whatever, type. It's a model. And then every other one after that was the same. So there's a prototype, the first type, which is, okay, this is the first of a new breed. But after that, the type continues. They just replicate the same one. I've got to polish it, adjust it, change its color, but it's the same thing that they use. So it's a chip off the old block. It's a piece of the original. Whenever you replicate these things. So DNA is the same. DNA doesn't change. You can turn on and off genes, but the DNA itself always replicates after its previous kind. So you've got these patterns there in all sorts of ways, and you can replicate them, but and if you are true to type, using that as a phrase, then you're going to stick with the original. So that's where types coming from, but let's move over to the arc bit. So arc is an interesting sort of suffix for any kind of word. It's slapped on the front of things like archaeology, as well as archetypes. And what other arcs can you think of? I mean, there's
Arch nemesis, or is that?
Okay, yeah. So arch rival, arch nemesis. It's the same spelling, the
Archangel.
same archangel. Okay, so what have we got there? We've got a bunch of things. We've got this concept of just like an arch. You're walking under an arch. It's over and above. Okay?
Okay.
So that's the first thing. But also it's got this sense of being old, like really old. So archaeology is ancient stuff.
So archaic as well.
Archaic. When you go to the archives, you're not expecting the latest editions of everything. You're expecting the old stuff in the archives, yeah. So, whereas archangels are the angels that are above all the other angels, yeah. So you've got a lot of these, and the archbishop, and the archduke, and it's the guy over and above, or old. So it speaks really about the master, the arch enemy, the arch criminal, the arch whatever, arch nemesis. That's the one you say. Cool. So it's like the master character from which all the other types take their form. So when I spoke about this at the global, what was it? The International Coach Federation Global Annual Conference. I was speaking with a former president of theirs, and I'd introduced this, and hardly anybody had heard of me there. And it's the largest coaching body in the world. They've got hundreds of thousands of members, and they have a global annual conference. And I was asked to be one of their catalysts, coming in and introducing new ideas. And so I said, well, to do the new, we've got to do the old, because the old has been forgotten and it's still here and you cannot escape it. We'll cover that off in a bit. You cannot escape the influence of archetypes, whether you know, the only issue is whether you know about them or not. They're there, they're present, they're real, and they are affecting the way that you're going about things all the time. So I presented it to these guys, and several things came through in that presentation. The first thing is I said, look, you haven't never heard of these before, and I'll often say, okay, stick your hands up, guys. How many of you know the term archetype and could describe it to somebody? And about a third of the room puts their hands up. Okay, how many of you have heard the term, but you're not quite sure about the definition? About another third put their hand up. And say, okay, how many of you have never heard the term before, haven't a clue what we're talking about? And about another third put their hands up. And this is amongst coaches and psychologists and clinicians of different sorts, work with psychology. And there's a lot of crazy stuff out there. I'll say to anybody, okay, if this is a new term to you, please don't put the term into Google, all right? You will get stuff coming at you from all sorts of directions, yeah? And some of it will be absolutely fine. A lot of Jung's work, who originally, he resurfaced the term, but he didn't originate it. People think they originated with him and Freud. Freud and he argued about these characteristics that they saw in people's dreams. I've got a patient who's had this character in the dream doing this stuff. Freud's like, yeah, I've seen someone doing exactly the same thing. I mean, mine was a woman, yours was a man, but they're doing the same sort of thing. This is weird. How can they both have access to this model of characteristics that don't relate to the real world, but represent issues in their deep psyche? Freud called it what did he call it? He called it a complex, and said they've got this bit of their brains which is just all gnarled up and causing this complex. And Freud started, so that was his analysis of it. Jung said, hold on, I think this is archetypal in that we need to look at, there's an original form that we all have an awareness of. And it's operating at different levels of the psyche, and dreams often bring these things to the surface. And I think that's what's going on, because there's this collective unconscious. And Freud went, rubbish. So they had differing opinions about what this is all about. But the fact that the dynamics were taking place in different patients of theirs, and this was 100 years ago, was evident to both of them. Now, they were using a term which was already in Greek understanding way back when. I mean, but the stuff that I've been looking up in terms of the history, there's a guy called Philo of Alexandria. He was a Hellenistic Jew, so he was familiar with the Jewish traditions, but he was also trained in the Greek philosophies. And he used to use the word archetype in all sorts of ways in his writings. which survived to this day. But there were others at the same time as him speaking the same sort of language as well. So it was common parlance to them to refer in as close as they got to psychology, then they would talk about archetypal characters and forms that they saw present in their own lives and in those around them. So it's been around 2,000 years. It's 2,000 years back. Yeah. And so it's at least that far. We could go back to Plato another 400 years earlier and talk about his ideas, but later.
Yeah, that's interesting stuff. I mean, my kind of understanding of archetypes, which is pretty basic, comes from familiarity with Jung and with kind of his readings of religions and kind of comparing what was going on in the kind of lives of his patients and the dreams that they were coming to him with, and him saying those kind of connect with these symbols that seem to be coming up over and again in these really old stories that are kind of cross-cultural.
Yes.
Kind of narratives of floods, for example, which is something that comes up in all sorts of creation myths. This is something that really tripped me out when I was an undergrad student. And I remember I was reading Ovid's Metamorphoses, a kind of Latin poem, and it begins with the story of flood coming and washing away the kind of like sinful form of mankind. And I was like, hang on, that's the Bible.
Yeah.
What the hell is that doing in Greco-Roman mythology?
Yeah. And the tale of Gilgamesh as well, which was dug up in Sumerian texts, which is probably the oldest myth that exists, speaks about a global flood as well. So there are these things. Now, again, this is where, let's not get into mythic literals now, about spiral dynamics. But there are certain things that are still prevalent in our psyche. Whether they're mythical or true, they're still with us. And that, I think, is in a sense the most important thing, because if they were just old and historic, well then, does history affect us or not? We're going to learn something from it or not? You can argue that both ways. But the truth is, if we find that these patterns are still here and still prevalent, whether it's something like a flood, and is that a metaphor for clearing the decks and starting anew, well, and then what does that actually mean for us? Well, we can go deep into that. Or are we going to start looking at, so there's archetypal events, creation in itself is an archetypal event in a way, because it's something which keeps happening in different arenas. The phoenix is an archetypal symbol, something which burns down to the ground, but out from the ashes, something new appears as well. So there are these symbols that occur throughout different cultures. The work of Joseph Campbell, who wrote the book The Hero of a Thousand Faces, spoke about the hero's journey, where in every culture he found this same pattern of that. It was usually male, but it's not exclusively male, where the guy is just a nobody and then faces a certain number of challenges, and then he gets a kind of quest in his heart and he starts going after it, and then he starts facing some battles, and then he goes to this level, and then there's this person appears who's always like his arch nemesis, and he has to work out, how do I deal with this, and I'm not enough, and all these things. And he found these patterns. It's like actually all these stories had the same sort of 7 or 8 key milestones on the way, so he just called it the hero's journey, and he mapped it from all sorts of characters throughout history, and we still see it playing out, in its broad form here today.
Yeah, but even in like modern movies, you have like the sort of general zero to hero sort of story that plays out even in not just in say superhero movies, but even in just sort of any narrative that involves like saving stuff or one individual character, discovering that they have all this powers or potential. Even, I don't know, to pick a completely random one, say like sort of Scott Pilgrim. If you've seen that movie or read those graphic novels, is it's kind of a classic hero's journey and has the same kind of hero faces these challenges, kind of triumphs over them, but then at some point it faces some huge problem and stops believing himself, and then has to start believing in himself again. And even this stuff it's basically been around for thousands of years, but it's still happening again and again today.
Yeah. So there are these general patterns. The hero's journey. I mean, George Lucas took Campbell's work, and he was particularly inspired by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette, who took the 4 key archetypal characters: the king, the lover, the magician. Help, what was the other? And he basically took those and said, from a male sort of development and maturity point of view, there are these 4 key archetypes. And he sort of tracked the development, but he also then, or they introduced the idea of an overheated state or an overinflated state or an underinflated state. So there's some really interesting dynamics there that you'll also see in story form as well. And I've taken that, and that was a key point for me. I took that model and started to work with that along with the kind of practical stuff that I'd done with people. I said, I like the model, and I did actually start using that with people. But then I began to say, well, hold on, there's a few distinctions that I think are necessary in order to make this work for everybody, especially the female part of the world, because they were focused on the male psyche.
Right.
And they said, oh, but this isn't exclusively for men. It's like, yeah, but it's highly male biased. And so how do we look at that? And so there's left brain and right brain stuff that we will go into, because that's really important. I don't think it's so important to divide between male and female, but I think it is important to divide between this notional idea of left and right brain. I know that's been challenged, but I've seen some brain scans which do show that certain types of thoughts originate on the left-hand side and certain types of thought originate on the right-hand side.
I think so. We've kind of spoken a bit about what is an archetype and sort of like the history of the idea, but perhaps we could talk a little bit about sort of what are some of the most common patterns or the most common figures that come up again and again, so we can actually really flesh this out for anybody who's listening.
So I must admit, there are some things I get geeky about, and these distinctions with characters is one of those areas. And I must admit, I get annoyed when I see certain people putting forward certain characters and saying they're archetypes. And I'm like, first of all, they just ain't old enough. My first thing is like a New York cabbie is not an archetype. They'll talk about the archetypal sort of businesswoman. Okay, maybe, yeah, there were, back in Roman times, there were businesswomen, but that was uncommon. Maybe you could call that an archetype, but not a New York cabbie. That's a stereotype, okay? So you've got to separate, is it old enough? Has it been around since time immemorial? That's my first test. For is it an archetype, or is it a stereotype, or even a prototype or something new? And so that's the first thing that I'll look at. With the model that was developed around the book Team Me, it was great because, people will say the most important book that you'll ever read is the one that you write. And for me, the exercise of putting that book together, which took me about 9 months, helped me to sort of really think through the issues, many of which I had a good framework, but it actually then helped me to really hammer out the detail and the depth to all of these characters. But the thing that did become clear very early on is that whatever people will propose in terms of names for archetypes, first of all, in a sense, the name isn't so much what's important, but the kind of energy is. So you can call it the king or the sovereign or the boss or the captain. They're all the same thing, I don't care. I call that character the sovereign. But it's, you can give it a whole bunch of different names. But for all of those, that there are common characteristics. So the sovereign, for example, the most important thing is they are commanding. They have their own sense of authority, whether it's been given to them or they just said, this is what I'm doing and I don't care what anybody else says. They have an authority. And they will then use that authority to command and control. Now, there's different ways of commanding and controlling, but they will enforce their expectations. And you either choose to go with it or not. If they've got authority over you, because they are the boss, if they can hire and fire you, then you either work with them or you quit and you leave somewhere else.
I think the example you used when we first spoke was of the Queen, kind of delegating, deciding what people do without actually doing anything really herself. Yeah,
so when there are degrees of all of these archetypes in each of us, and we will do a little exercise where we can just sort of scribble on some paper and we'll come out with how much of these characters is in each one of us. So I've got an online tool. So if you toddle over to teamme.app, you can get online and fill in a bunch of questions, and then you get the two most dominant archetypes were presented back to you. But the truth is the system's actually measuring 6 different archetypes, and it'll show you where you are with each of them. So we're focusing on the sovereign at the moment. Everybody's got a degree of that sovereign. Yeah, you might not feel you've got a large area of responsibility, but the bigger that it is, then the more that sovereign has to step up. Yeah, for some teenage kids, it's just their bedroom, and they're responsible for sorting out their bedroom, and that's their realm of authority. But then they have exams at school. Well, then it's their business to take control of their minds, to take control of their pencil case, to take control of what it is they need to do. So there's a little bit of responsibility that they've got, But as they grow up, that area of responsibility grows and grows and grows.
So, like, say, Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping might be the sort of most intense example of a sort of sovereign manifesting itself in someone who is alive today.
Yeah.
Or maybe even, like, anyone who's at the top of a very big company, say Jeff Bezos even, like.
Absolutely, yeah. And so you will always get a mix of these characters, and so the sovereigns are never just, kingly or queenly. They will project themselves and behave in slightly different ways because of the other mix of archetypes. So if you take Steve Jobs, for example, clearly strong with sovereign. He comes in, he controls the show, he says, right, getting rid of all those products, fire the people who fired him, and then start working with, this is the vision. The first thing, vision. The vision is the inspirational thing. Yeah, so they set the vision. Now we'll talk about the mystic and their view on vision as well. But they operate through a delegated power in order to do the sovereign thing. But one of the most important things they do is they set a new vision. You know what it's like in politics if a party just hasn't even got a clear vision.
Yeah, that's how you lose
very
election,
quickly, everybody just loses confidence. It's like, we don't even know what you stand for anymore, Where are you taking us? You don't follow a leader if you don't know where they're taking you, So the vision is crucial. Jobs came back into Apple, and the first thing he did was a new vision. Guys, this is what we stand for, and this is what we're going for. And boy, did he turn that whole situation around. But there's another archetype that was really very strong with Jobs, which was the mystic. And so we will go through all of these, but whilst we're on the subject, the mystic is the innovator. They can dream big and they break the rules. So the sovereign is all about maintaining order and keeping rules. But the mystic is just like, stuff that order, let's create something new, What if? What if is the kind of clarion call of the mystic, and I have a dream. Yeah. You've heard that before.
Yeah.
So there'll be some people who are strong with sovereign and strong with mystic, and some will be slightly stronger on mystic, and others will be slightly stronger on sovereign. And there's a mix of the other archetypes as well. Whereas Bill Gates and Steve Jobs would regularly get together and have little conflabs, even whilst they were pitted against each other in the computer world as they kind of growing their businesses together. But and I've got this classic picture of the two of them sitting there. And Gates was sovereign sage. He's looking much more at the facts. The emotions are not part of his equation. He's much more almost like a Mr. Spock type of character, or Sherlock Holmes. No one can get close to them emotionally, but they're very factually based.
Like the rational,
and it's
objective.
all rational. So you've got this shot of Gates there, perfectly symmetrical, hands together doing this. Classic thing from the sage. They're just sitting there going, yes. Whereas Jobs is just like this. Totally asymmetrical, kind of waving hands around all over the place and dreaming big and getting emotionally tied in. That's trash, we ought to be thinking this and thinking that.
Yeah.
Whereas Gates is a lot more, it would be highly logical. Sounding Spock-like. It would be highly logical, Captain, if we pursued this based on the evidence that we have. And so, I'm being comical, but you can hear that the characteristics of each of these characters is, I know that character. Straight away, you recognize it. And that's why this works in boardrooms and this works in high maximum security prisons. I've had the opportunity to be in both places.
Wow.
And you can speak archetypal language and you can get a conversation going instantly. What if we were more warrior about the way we went about this? I don't need to really explain that. But, the details, yes. But in terms of the energy that you're bringing to the situation, I don't need to explain. So, hang on, what's this warrior person? It's like, that warrior person. Tell me one time in your past when you just had to get it done. like life or death, get it done. And people will just go, and they're beginning to feel it already,
Fire.
Yeah,
Like,
it's just like,
now.
get out of my way,
Up.
Energy,
I'm going to make this happen. And warriors don't care for people when they're on a mission. It's like, that's the one thing I'm going to do. And if people are getting in the way, get out of my way, it's just do it. Just do it as the warriors.
And like, even when you say it, like we should be more warrior about this. Like, you don't even without, I think that statement on its own, 99% of people who heard it will understand exactly what you mean with just with the abstract concept of like warrior, but then being warrior about something. Everyone just intrinsically knows like, oh, that means being like gung-ho and like not compromising and just like absolutely going for it. And it's very, very easy to conceptualize.
Yeah. And it gets you in the gut.
Yeah.
It accesses something down here, whereas to go into a maximum security prison and to say, we're going to do a Myers-Briggs profile on you. We've got 16 different types to consider here, and I've got these questions for you. So in this situation, would you prefer to be this or that? Like the guy's going to be going, what's going on? Whereas if you just say, okay, so who's the king here? And everybody looks over at Jake and, okay, who's ruling this.
Is that what you did?
Whatever the delegated authority is. It's, to be honest, you can tell by the way they sit.
Yeah.
And usually, back to the Queen thing, a mature sovereign is the stillest person in the room.
Cue everyone trying to be as still as possible.
Not frightened, not freeze and faint, but it's the person who's just sitting there, they're kind of looking around, but that's that. And then if they want anything done, they've already built their team around them. So they're just like, Harry, just, nah, thank you. And that's kind of it. It's the slightest, there's no effort in the mature sovereign. Later we'll talk about shadow archetypes, because any one of these archetypes can go into this, what I call overheated state, but there's also a frozen state. So it's worth us exploring those, because when you see those dynamics, you then begin to understand why certain people behave the way they do under pressure. So we can look at that in a moment, but let's get clear on which the archetypes are. We've talked about the sovereign, we've talked about the mystic, we've mentioned the sage. The others that I work with then, so to go through, there's a specific order to the way that I teach this. So it's the sovereign, then the warrior, then the sage, and then it's the mystic, the lover, and the jester. And every one of us has got something of those characters inside of us, and we can call on them whenever it's necessary. And what you'll also find is that even if it's sage, but the jester's reasonably high, you'll find you're doing the sage thing first. But once you've filled your quota of, I've done enough sageness today, I've looked at enough facts, I've got things into shape and order, and I'm confident about the factual, evidence-based calculations and all the rest. I've got to a certain level of truth, in whatever it is that I'm establishing here, especially accountants, great view of the sages, they have to be factual, they have to be cool-headed. No, you don't want to bring emotions into your finances if you've got an accountant. An emotional accountant is a liability. You want somebody who will coolly look at the figures and say, this is what the numbers say. Any data analyst the same.
Strikes me as being kind of almost computational.
It's purely rational. And there's some of these, they'll say that he's just like a walking computer,
I've known people like that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's definitely something that exists out there in the world that some people express exactly that. And then also the same with all the ones you mentioned. I can think of people I know who I'm like, oh yeah, that person has a lot of mystic qualities, or oh, that guy's a total sage.
And we see it in every sitcom. We see it in every movie, and the bigger the movie, the more they're able to put in these mixes, So when I just work with the power profiles with people, which gives me the most immediate view, but it's a little bit reductionist, but it still helps to get something moving with these guys, is to work out, well, which is the strongest and which is the kind of supporting, so a leading character and a supporting character, and when we do that, there's even of just those, when you're working with 6 archetypes, you've got 30 different variations to play with, 30 different character types, but I can instantly then say, okay, so this is what you're strong at, these will be your weak points, and these are the relationships you'll find easy, and these are the ones you'll find difficult, and these are the ones you'll gravitate towards, whether helpfully or not helpfully, and when you're under pressure, this is your likely way of performing. So these are the things which instantly before I mean, this is my greatest game, is that I'll go into either a team or founder or an entrepreneur will come along, I'll see their profile, say, fill in these questions, they fill in the questions. I've got my view of where the archetypes are, and I'll say, okay, so just give me 2 minutes on your role. So I'm the head of the company, and we're in logistics, and we do this and this and that and the other. You got any teams? Yeah, I got teams of this. I got okay, fine. Geographically, fine. Let me tell you how you operate with your team. Let me tell you how you are in meetings. Let me tell you how you are in terms of which sort of levels of the organization you engage with. Let me tell you your highest priorities. Let me tell you, and I basically for 15 minutes, I can tell them all sorts of stuff about them just from this profile. To which they go, okay. And once or twice they'll say, well, I wouldn't quite word it that way. And so there's slight different languages because this is me reading stuff. But essentially I can play back to them once they've done that profile. And all they've done is answer a kind of, is this very much you or is this not so much you? 5 degrees of question, and that's all available online for people can fill that in. But it's the interpretation of that as you get used to these characters, what are the dynamics when somebody is strong with sovereign and sage, and all the world's a stage, and then with the others being lower. But what if the lover is strong with the sovereign? Well, then you end up with a Richard Branson type character.
So can we flesh out a little bit more about the kind of lover and the jester?
Yeah, we haven't gone there, have we? So let's do that. The lover is not just the romantic type, the Romeo and Juliet lover type. It's the person who cares about people.
Okay.
And so other archetypes, people will talk about the carer and then the sort of the romantic and all the rest. Well, I kind of lump them all together with that person who's able to tap into that. It's a passionate place. It's an empathetic place. It's a place where they care about others. Yeah. And essentially, those are the people that in a board meeting, if you've got anybody who's strong on love, and they don't tend to get through to the board level when they're too strong on that. They tend to get pushed off. It's either HR or it's out the door or it's push them down. Because they with a patriarchal sort of system, we tend to end up with the guys being elevated who are more commanding and get things done. So there's an interesting dynamic, but anybody who's steering a company or any body of people needs to recognize who the lover types are, because they're the ones who are going to be bringing harmony to what might just get disparate or factional. Yeah, that they're the ones that will bring people together. They hate it when there's strife in the room. They want to run away, but they will, depending on how much warrior's in them, they will also then say, actually, let's make this happen, let's come together. But if they're weak on warrior, they're not even going to put their energy into harmonizing. They want harmony, but they won't enforce it.
Okay, yeah.
The warrior enforces. Yeah.
I see.
And so this is where the mix is important, you to recognize that. Both the warrior and the lover are driven by passion. The sovereign and the mystic are both driven by power, one through delegated power and one through influence, which isn't always delegated, but they have a remarkable ability to put things together, to connect people in a way to influence outcomes without necessarily. So sometimes the mystics are not very high in the organization, or if they're on the board, they're not kind of the key players, not often. But it depends. It depends on how much innovation is elevated within the organization. And the last two, the jester and the sage, operate through perception. So they're both known as clever. They both have the ability to take words in particular and situations, and they kind of dissect them. And the sage does it for learning.
And the jester
does it
for
for laughter. One studies history because it's important. We can draw lessons from it. The other one does it because it's quite hysterical. And this is why things like Blackadder are brilliant. Because the jester gets a chance to pull apart history and laugh at it. And then they went, okay, if it's not, Queenie and Elizabeth I. Well, let's go up to the First World War, or you can take it to any moment in history and let the jester go to town on it,
It's amazing that kind of, that comedy, that energy of laughter seems to be so important in human cultural dynamics.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to kind of understand exactly where it comes from or why. I don't know. I don't think animals do it particularly, but humans, we love to mock things and to see the absurdity and the irony in situations.
Yeah, and that's where the jester comes from. So jesters, of course, like all of these characters, if they get overheated, they can become quite nasty with people, and they use their humour to tear people down and to build themselves up. So they just become the idiot in that situation where self-id is elevated. They do things their own way. And they don't consider the feelings of other people in particular. So you'll see this, you go to some comedy night, and there'll always be some person who has a big chunk of their act is tearing down, and I think that people generally now just think, we can do that actually. It's fine to poke a bit of fun, but if it goes a bit too far, if it's just tearing down, it's like, actually, I just don't feel good in that sort of environment, So, okay, skip that and go for the clean comedians, the guys who are actually, you come away and you actually feel really built up and you're buzzing with a good sense of fun. You didn't go around tearing others down to do so. So jesters can swing into that space, and particularly when their show isn't going very well, they'll start pulling a whole heap of sexual innuendos, and they'll also bring in criticism of others, and that's when they're starting to get desperate.
Like the cheap shots, basically.
It is. It's cheap shots, just trying to, it's like, go, sorry, lose that.
You can laugh the first time.
Yeah. So, and the mature ones have got this sense of confidence and trust in themselves and in their material. They're not trying too hard, even the jester. But still, the jester will always be trying to surprise and delight, So there are some people that go more on the entertainment side. It's interesting that you can map these archetypes to days of the week, which is a deep thing here. Did we talk about this earlier, where you can actually... Yeah, really interesting thing. You were talking about archetypal stuff going back. Have you ever studied the names of the days of the week and what they represent?
I'm aware that one of the days is named after Thor.
Yes, that is true.
So I think that's Thursday? So I'm going to assume
Thursday,
that's the Warrior Day.
Absolutely the Warrior Day.
Okay, so Monday is Moon Day.
Yes, it is.
And Sunday is Sunday. So I guess, I don't know, Moon? Who's Moon?
Well, okay, the interesting thing here is that every culture has acknowledged planets against the days of the week.
Oh.
The spooky thing is that so there's places where this comes together. There's a couple of places where a bit of Chinese whispers has influenced things, especially interesting enough with the Chinese, who look at the elements, the 5 elements as being the 5 days of the week and the weekend. It's still, funnily enough, the sun and the moon. So why should the Chinese and the Japanese and the Tibetans and the Aztecs and the ancient American Indians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Nordics and all the rest, where they still had their Norse gods, but they still acknowledged the sun on Sunday and the moon on Moon Day. And every culture that has tried to disrupt the 7-day week has gone back to the 7-day week, not just because of internationalism, even before internationalism was important.
Yeah.
The French tried to do it after the Revolution.
The French Revolution.
The Russians tried to do it. The Chinese tried to do it. They all reverted back to the 7-day week.
Oh, that's very interesting.
You've got the sun on Sunday, you've got the moon on Monday. Then the French is the easiest way to remember the rest. So you've got Mardi. Which planet?
Mars.
You've got Mercredi.
Mercury, love. Love? No?
We'll look at what those meanings are in a moment. We're going deeply off course here, it's archetypal.
Yeah,
it is archetypal. So you've got Mercredi, you've got Vendredi. Well, actually, it was Jeudi first.
Oh, Jeudi,
which is Thursday.
Which is Jupiter.
It is
which
Jupiter.
Is the sovereign.
Not quite, but I'll play back a couple of things just to round this up, because we've segued into something, but it is actually interesting that in my studies, I came out with 6 archetypes, and they do, funnily enough, map to 6 of the days of the week. And then there's an overall, but okay.
There's a 7th day,
I want to
isn't
map
there?
this. There is a 7th day, and I'll explain that in a minute. And the easiest way to think about that is rainbows, but we'll go there in a moment. Then it's unicorns. And this is weird because this is probably where it seems like the wheels are falling off, and you think we've gone into some really spooky stuff here. But let's just push through with the days of the week to start with.
Okay.
Jeudi, then vendredi,
What would
and
be
then
Venus? That would be
Venus.
the lover.
Now that's an interesting one because you would think so.
I guess that's the
But
general association.
let me play with one other thing around that, because then this is where what things have become is not necessarily what they originally were.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
of course.
Now, there's always places at which some of this will separate a little bit. And I keep asking myself, am I trying to just fit these things together? I saw a pattern. Does that mean I'm trying to squash it in for the rest? And I'm still open to interpretation and challenge on some of those things. But I'll explain a few of these things in a minute. And the last one is Samedi, which is
Saturn.
It is Saturn. So
I would guess that was the sage, maybe.
almost.
Well, I could see it being the mystic as well.
There's another one though. Saturnalia was a big feast, an agricultural feast. It was the feast of harvest, and so Saturn, worshipped on Saturday, was related to feasts and entertainment. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, Saturn's an interesting character in mythology because he's really stern, and yet he also spawned the feasts. So it's a kind of interesting dichotomy between these two sort of poles that exist in the same character. So you've got Saturday, which is interesting, but the entertainment side of things, it's like, we've done all our work for the week, let's party. Okay.
Of course, yeah, it's the beginning of the weekend.
So it's a bit strange to think Saturn isn't normally put forward in that way. But I'll often say to people, if the board members are starting to say, we don't need any of the jester here, he's of no use. And my first thought is, then let's take Saturday out of the week. And now that's
true.
a mystic's way of transcending a situation and coming at it with a metaphor. Yeah, mystics always go for metaphors. But then even sages can get that. Yeah. Sages work with knowledge, mystics work with understanding, and they're kind of related, but they're actually two different dynamics.
Yeah, of course, because you can know everything. If you don't understand any of it, what is it worth?
Yeah, and if you don't know much, but you have a great level of understanding, you can do an awful lot. You can transcend and transform. So the watchwords of the dynamics of the mystic is to transcend and transform. They come in with a different perspective. Yeah.
And that makes me think of that kind of computation metaphor again, right? Sort of like knowledge is being able to almost use knowledge that's already there and kind of churn, make equations work and roll off things that have been discovered. But
machine
there's
learning.
that other type of thinking, which is sort of creative, synthesizing thought. Right? Where you're able to identify a pattern and go, this and this go together, and everybody else goes, no, you're mad.
Yeah.
But that's where that's what innovation is, as you've said.
And some people would invent whole new industries, you know. And this is where, I mean, even with the Model T Ford, when Ford came out with his first idea of a car, and that classic line, if I'd asked the people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. He had a different way of looking at, hold on, these mechanisms and this engine thing, well, we could put wheels on that.
Yeah.
And as long as we got something called a brake, we could do something with this, So he comes out with his first one. I mean, there were cars before him, of course.
Yeah.
He wasn't the inventor of the car, but he had the idea of the mass production. So he added his sage thing to it. But the first thing he had was the vision. He had the vision of that, and then he implemented it. And he knew he was sage enough to know that he needed people brighter than him on the case. It was a great big court case. They were trying to tear him apart in the media. And I'm sure he wasn't the nicest of all characters to work with, but they tried to tear him apart, and they were trying to sort of throw questions at him to see whether he was intelligent or thick.
Oh, really?
And they were literally throwing questions about, who was the 13th president of the United States? And he just, at some point, just said, this is entirely irrelevant. What you need to know is that when I don't have the answer to a question, I've got 13 buzzers on my desk or whatever it was, and I press the button and the guy comes into the room. I ask him, because I have people working for me who do have the answers, and that's how I run this company. You know? So
cool.
it was kind of irrelevant, because as a sovereign, he doesn't need to know everything. He just needs to bring in the right things at the right time to make sure that vision actually happens. Yeah. So
we go back to the days of the week stuff.
My word, how did we get off the days of the week? So how deep do we go on this? There's a color coding to the archetypes that I've never actually explained. I shall do that sometime. I will do it here now. Where actually people think about the colors of the rainbow. How many colors are there in a rainbow?
7. Hey,
people talk about the 7 colors of the rainbow. Now, the truth is, though, have you ever looked at a rainbow?
Kind of infinite colors in a rainbow.
There are, and so you can kind of divide it up whichever way you want. But in truth, I've never seen anybody look at a rainbow and go, there's the red, there's the orange, there's the yellow, there's the green, there's the blue, there's the indigo, and there's the violet. Yeah. It's just purple, for goodness sake.
Yeah,
it's just
exactly.
One
yeah,
colour.
the sort of blue, indigo, violet. You could just say blue and purple. Yeah.
Blue and purple is the way to go. Now, that simplifies it. Now, what happens if you show them all at the same time, though? You end up with white.
White, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
That's Sunday. White is Sunday. All of the others are kind of wrapped up into the culmination of the 6 archetypes. So there is a 7th, but there isn't a 7th. There's a 7th in the sense that if you put the others together, you will end up with all the other colours of the rainbow. Squash them together, you get the white light.
Okay, so that's kind of like, I mean, would you say that is in some senses analogous to someone who has a more or less, who has no archetype stronger than any other in any way, and so they would come out as just non-archetyped, and that would, in a way...
So they're just bright and shiny like a lighthouse. And in a sense, that is true. We've all got flavours, and you can see it from a colour point of view. I did even wonder at some point whether it was worth creating the 6 as different colours and then saying, okay, well, what would that do if you literally had colours? Red for the sovereign, then you'd have yellow, which is the lover, then you'd have orange for the mystic, and I'll explain why that's all put together. It seems to jump around. Ooh, I'm going to throw in something else here.
Okay.
I will. I'll round that up. The colours are quite specific, but they do match to the days of the week, and then the archetypes match to the days of the week as well. So let's jump back to things like Thor, the warrior. Okay, so Jupiter was associated with Thor according to Tacitus, who was the Roman historian who started looking at these Germanic tribes and these Nordic tribes that we're now beginning to invade. Oh, they've got different gods. Oh, it's funny that because we're looking at Mercury as one of their gods, well, that ties back to one of our guys quite specifically. So, and then they've got Jupiter, and then they've got Mars, and they were trying to say, well, how do these guys fit with ours? But actually, the tie can be seen between the names that we have in the days of the week. It's funny, isn't it, that the days of the week that the pagans gave in terms of Mars and Mercury and help. Thor.
Jupiter.
So okay, I'm
Thor,
jumping between the two here. I ought to have them all listed here. When I write this on the board, it's easier.
Basically,
It just so happens that according to Tacitus's writings, Thor and Jupiter were the same god.
Yeah.
And Thursday and Jeudi happen to be the same day.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and Tu and Mardi. So you've got Mars and you've got Tu, and they just happen to be the same day.
Oh,
and Tacitus said it's the same. So in other
words, Germanic
it's
tribes had come up with the same ordering of the week and ordering of the different
the characters were the same
with the days,
and they matched up with what Tacitus said. These, in terms of their characteristics, they're the same. Now we think about Mars as being the god of war, but actually it's not so much the case. And so Jupiter, according to Tacitus, Jupiter matched to Thor.
Thor, yeah.
You think Thor, god of war, Mars, god of war, but it's actually no. Go back to the days of the week and you'll find the original understanding. Later, we've turned men are from Mars and women from Venus.
Yeah.
Nice little phrase, but it doesn't match up to the original understanding of the original characters.
Modern invention.
It's a modern invention. So we could decipher that further, but I'm just pulling out a few of those.
Cool.
Back to our rainbow.
Okay.
Start at the top. The first archetype is the sovereign. Red is actually the color of wisdom, and it's what the sovereign archetype is all about. That actually matches to Monday.
See, I kind of associate red with a more kind of like almost the colour of anger. Is that
which you would associate with
warrior
and Thor?
Yeah.
Okay. Think of it in terms of power. A lot of people think of red as a power colour. Okay, but that doesn't really reflect the sort of power that you see in nature. When you scatter seeds on the ground, there is this determined, unstoppable life that breaks through anything and everything, works together, dominates the environment, has this sort of passion inside it to dominate and grow. You can't stop it growing unless you try and poison it. It has an innate ability and a desire to grow and grow and grow. So when you start looking at it that way, it's in nature. Well, then green kind of fits that a lot better than red. If you're trying to sum up what is that drive that's behind nature.
Unstoppable force of life.
And this is where it's interesting that, we've come to associate certain things, and there's all sorts of people who do colour psychology, and they'll always use red as the dominant, pushy, go-getting sort of thing. But I have a slightly different view of it, and this is where, but I had to come to terms with that myself. It's like the culture that we're in today seems to think red is that warrior thing. So why doesn't it match up with the colours of the rainbow, which seem to match up with the days of the week? And so there's these patterns of 7, which is what I'm coming down to. And the more I explore it, the more fun it gets.
Though, to pick a really random analogy, like, on the one hand, we kind of think of red as violent and bad, but actually, and this is the silliest thing, if you imagine a traffic light, red is stop.
Yep.
Red is giving you an order. Yeah? Red is like halt. Like, I am in charge, like, whereas green is like, go. Green is like flowing through. Green is like movement. Green is like energy.
Nice.
So in a weird way, sort of the way we, at least on a traffic light, lines up a lot better with...
It's there.
And red's also emergency. Pay attention to this, which is pure sovereign, right?
It is sovereign. The sovereign will say, this is what's acceptable and this is not acceptable. This is the border. This is the boundary. The red line.
Yeah.
This is what the sovereign does. Now, it's the warrior enforces that dictate, but it's the sovereign who draws the line. So when I'm working with people in relationships, I'm always looking for who's setting the rules and how much are they setting the rules. So victims and slaves have a hard time dealing with clear boundaries. They keep giving way. They keep giving way. So the slave makes no decisions of their own. They're told what to do. So that's kind of the opposite of the sovereign.
Yeah, a deflated sovereign.
And a deflated sovereign is actually the deflated or the frozen state, I call it. Interesting then that also the warrior. Wow, we're jumping around here, aren't we?
Let's
Let's
wrap
go back.
up the days of the week colour stuff, and then
Thank
we
you
can
for
move
keeping
on
me
to the
on track.
deflated
This
state.
is too much mystic here. I'm going off.
I love the mystic
And the
stuff.
justice
Let's wrap that up.
Good. So what we have with the days of the week, interesting that all these cultures seem to talk about the same order of planets across the board, although we've got the elements, and there's an interesting tie of the elements, but I'm still working on that one. But the Latin view and the kind of Norse view is exactly the same. And at least every culture of the world acknowledges the sun first and the moon second. So it's interesting that the moon has no light of its own. It purely reflects the sun. And interesting that of the 7 archangels, arc again.
Yes.
7 of them.
The first day of the week, which represents, the first one is Michael. And Michael means who is like God. The divine is wrapped up in the white light at the first day of the week. The second one is called Jehudiel, and his name means God is my light. The moon's
so
light
he's the reflection.
is the reflection.
Yeah.
He has no light of his own. Interesting that. And the other 7 actually match up as well. And whilst we're sticking with Hebrew understanding here, I looked at, they have this thing called the menorah, which was from the temple. So in the temple they have 7
candles.
It's a candle with 7 branches.
7 branches, yeah.
They added it to 9 later, which, interesting enough, they found 9 planets, but there were 7 known planets originally. And I looked at the order of them, and you have the sun, which is the big one in the middle, and then you have all these other ones, and it wasn't Philo, maybe it was Philo of Alexandria, who said they actually represent the planets, the known planets at that time. So you've got Mercury in there, and Jupiter, and Mars, and Venus, etc., and Saturn. And so I was looking at that, and I was saying, yeah, but the order doesn't make sense. You've got the sun in the middle, and then, Mercury's here, and the moon's here, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And then I found another text which said, yeah, but the priest would light them in this order. And I was absolutely gobsmacked. He lights them in the order of the days of the week according to the planets that we've associated with the days of the week.
Wow.
So he goes, the sun, the moon, and then it's Mars, and then it's Mercury, and then it's Jupiter, and then it's Saturn. And you think, why?
What's this text?
I could dig it up. But
Yeah.
so it came, Philo of Alexandria spoke about the association with the planets and which ones they were in this order. But then there was another text which spoke about the tradition of, which a Jewish tradition, about the order with which they were lit. Because to start with, I thought, I wish that would have worked out, but the order just doesn't make any sense. And then it's like, no, but I was counting it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so there is these. The point is, there's something running really, really deep, which goes way back in time. And so, what does that mean for us? We've looked at the patterns. I know I haven't gone through all the colors of the rainbow, but it matches up beautifully. That if you look at the association with the archetypes and the kind of godlike characters that are matched into the days of the week, and then the colours of the rainbow I now use, although I don't speak of them, I just have, but I don't normally speak about them. But whenever I depict the sovereign, I'll very often put the red colour behind that, and it's a subliminal message. And the warrior, it's the green, and the lover, it's the yellow. And again, if you think, well, this is kind of jumping in order, it doesn't follow my order of the left brain characters, which is the sovereign, and then the warrior, and then the sage. Those are left brain types, rational, following the evidence, following their a clear process-driven way of thinking.
Linear, right?
A linear way of looking at things, compared to the other 3 that are right brain. So the mystic, the lover, and the jester. More emotional, but it's not just emotional ways. Any kind of rational and emotional, sort of that, but a lot more creative, thinking out of the box.
Synthetic, associative.
Yeah. Associative is a better way of looking at it, so that's great. And I think that's a more useful way of looking at it than just male and female, because there are some females that are actually quite strong with the initial stuff, but we're all a mix. And I think it's more useful to look at it in terms of this right brain and left brain characteristics, much as that has been decried by certain individuals at the moment, but I still think it's a useful general way of looking at stuff. So as you kind of jumping around, initially I just thought, well, it doesn't tie together, but then I found things like the menorah text about the menorah, and then started looking at the colors, and actually if you line them up, left brain and right brain, and you just snake between them, the order's there, so difficult to show without diagramizing all of these things, but there's a pattern that runs really deep. And we've talked a lot about the days of the week, but that to me just reinforced that actually these 6 characters that I almost stumbled upon, I kind of just thought, oh, it makes more sense to do this, and what name shall I call that? Okay, well then that's the sage. The sage didn't exist in Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette's model. They didn't have the sage in there. they had the magician instead of the mystic. Fair enough, I don't really care what you call it. But they didn't have the jester in there as well. And I thought it is important to separate the jester from the lover. Yeah, they kind of lumped the lover together. So that's the creative one. I said, yeah, but there's also some people who are really funny and entertaining who don't actually have much of a care for people. We need to do a separation there. You can't lump them into the mystic either, you know, because there are some people who are very spiritual and dreamy and don't have a love for people. Without mentioning Steve Jobs specifically, there are certain individuals who actually are known for that, who didn't treat people very well.
Spiritual hermits even, who reject kind of worldly things and people and go to live in a cave and contemplate the divine on their own.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a archetypal motive itself, right? Is the journey into the wilderness. Jesus is 40 days in the wilderness, or Moses going up onto Mount Sinai on his own
for 40 days as well. So there are those times. The wilderness is in a sense an archetypal environment. So there are other types of archetypes, but when I'm working on performance improvement, I look at what's going on inside the person, what makes them tick at that deepest level. And that's where we start, you know, playing with that, uncovering stuff and saying, okay, well then what if it was this way? Or what if you were this way? What if you were more warrior about the way you approach this, you know? And then how does that feel? And so some of them, it's just like, well, it's just not me, I don't want to go there. Well, then you've got a choice. You either get into the gym and you start working those muscles, which sometimes is going to save the company. And a leader will be prepared to do whatever it takes to become who they need to be in order to lead. Or you say, actually, I could do that, but really I might as well play to my strengths and go with what's best, and I'm going to get the accountant in to deal with the figures. That's my approach. But cool. I don't abdicate, I delegate, and I learn enough to know how to work with the guys with the figures.
Yeah, cool.
Even though it's not my main thing.
Yeah. So you don't have to necessarily change your entire self, but you have to make sure that your team and the group you're in has the bases covered.
So you're talking earlier about, are there people who are like that white light where they're all so strong? There are a few people. There's one guy who I've reconnected with recently, and he did his profile, and I said, yeah, that makes sense, because I know this guy can play whatever game you give him. Yeah. And he was really strong on all of them. Some a little stronger than others, but he was really up there with all of them. And he will, he can be who he needs to be, and he is a massive influencer himself. And he can play whatever part is necessary.
That's interesting. So what sort of types or combinations do you find kind of playing out repeatedly in kind of different contexts? So for example, do business owners or leaders tend to have certain traits?
So you've got to have the sovereign in business. And anybody who is seeking promotion, I mean, as soon as somebody comes to me and says, I need promotion, then I just think, okay, so we need the warrior, we need the sovereign program, probably backed up with a bit of warrior. But it might be that the sage is more important than the warrior. So those two could be either, but definitely the sovereign. They're going to need to step up because they need to take on more responsibility and be shown that they can have something delegated to them, and they'll sort it. They will own it. And that owning is part of the sovereign thing. So any kind of promotion requires that. Definitely, anybody who's leading any organization, whether it's commercial or charity or whatever, will need to have a measure of that sovereign. But if somebody comes along and says, I'm a 10 on a sovereign, my thought is, I'm more comfortable with a 9, because if you're a 10, it basically means you don't bow to anybody. If you're totally sovereign. So there are slight danger signs when I see anybody marking themselves as a 10. There's always, you can go overboard if you're not balanced out. So you've got to have a certain balance. But I also see people who are very immature with certain things, and they'll say, I'm in business, but their archetype profile shows their kind of 4s and 3s on everything. I'm just like, this person's naive. Sorry, but they don't step up. They don't step up to the plate. They let things happen to them because they're just not strong with those archetypes. So if you're in innovation, you've got to have strong mystic. So if I'm doing a company-wide review, and it's great because the filling in the questions only takes about 90 seconds each. And so you give everybody, get on your mobiles, bang all this in here. And then, 2 minutes later, you've got a map of the entire company, and then I just start reading. It's like, okay, so the innovation department, okay, it makes sense, but this guy, okay, he's probably going to be causing a bit of a problem with these guys. They need to be freed up to do what they're doing, because he's too sage, and he's going to start saying to them, that will never work because, It's like, so that's fine to bring in later, but don't bring him in the initial brainstorms. Or tell him, guys, this is a slightly different way of doing things here. So you can start zooming in on pockets of what's going on. Sales need to be good with the warriors and the lover. They need both. And a fair amount of sage, because consultative selling is the best way of selling. It shows you know what they need and you've thought it through, etc.
The lover in sales is you've got to be able to communicate with people and get them on board with what...
If you don't build that level of respect, there's an argument around this. So there's got to be a certain level, but if it's too strong, it's equally going to work against the whole selling process. You really need to build respect, and that doesn't always come through the lover. But if you are just not listening and not empathizing with the person over the table, if over the table you are, the lover would not like that situation in you and try and rearrange things. But if you don't have that empathy with where they're at, and there's got to be some sense of the lover in order to do that, then you're going to have a hard time persuading them that you're actually on their side. They'll just think you're trying to calculate how to get money out of them, So there's got to be that trust, and that's where the lover is important. But you also need the warrior, because these guys need to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it. And if they do 3 phone calls and get 3 rejections and then go, oh, I can't stand this anymore, I'm taking it personally. Then they're sunk. They need to keep at it and keep at it, and that's necessary. Whereas a consultant in the traditional world who's not necessarily trying to sell will need sage and warrior strongest, Whilst the sovereign can be a little bit lower, those they're responsible for their own area, but it's not like they have to run the show. They're not going in to tell the client, I'm coming to take control, unless they've been given control. But they are there to be discerning and then to push it through. To see it through. Some consultants are just lots of sage and not enough warriors. It's like, this is what you should be doing. Bye. And that's no use, I think.
Do you find yourself advising people about their actual kind of career paths and directions they take based on the archetypes that kind of...
So it's most powerful when I work with entrepreneurial teams. That's the most fun. Because things immediately become apparent that they were aware of, but they hadn't ever languaged it and hadn't really understood what was going on there. But I've also, one of the first business owners that I dealt with was a woman who had a Portuguese property company. And in discussions, she said, well, my biggest problem is that we're growing too quickly. A lot of people say, that's not a problem, or that's a good problem to have. She said, it's killing me. I can't keep up with the paperwork and this and that and that, and I wish I could just go out and meet these guys. I said, okay, let's do an archetype profile. And she was very low. She was okay on sovereign, very low on sage, quite low on warrior. And the lover was through the roof, and the mystic was through the roof, and then the jester was kind of in the middle somewhere. You think, and you're running the company. Okay, so naturally, I suspect that you just love dreaming dreams for yourself and for other people. So when people come to you as a client, it's just like, I can just see this. Okay, you're saying this. Well, what about this? And what about a pool with that property? And what about actually having a little lodge at the end of the... And they're just like, oh, that would be amazing. So she's plugged in with her lover. She's plugged into where they're at. She's given them an even bigger dream. She's getting excited herself. And now she's got to do the paperwork. She hates the paperwork. And so she's up until silly hours at night doing all the paperwork, and she's thinking, I wish I could go and meet another couple of people to talk about their dreams and connect with them. So I said, well, you need a CEO, don't you? She's like, what? I said, well, at least a managing director. Hire somebody who loves that stuff, who loves bringing things into order, loves getting things right, somebody who's strong with sage, warrior enough to get that paperwork done, but actually it's strong with sage, and then is willing to take responsibility. So with sovereign's got to be fair, sage has got to be really high, warrior's got to be okay, And there's tolerance with those. It transformed the way, but I said you need a partnership. You need to set up with somebody. You need to trust them. And as always, you don't just sign the paper straight away. You trial. the relationship for both sakes of both parties. Lots of people get ripped off getting into something, they sign the paper and the person runs away with at least half, if not more, of the company having done nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
So you need to test them out that way. So, and that's a sage way of dealing with a relationship. So, make sure that you've got the structure in place, and a sovereign way, you're setting boundaries. So that really, really, and just even imagining that, you could see the weight just dropped off her whole expression.
Yeah.
Just like, I could actually get paid to meet people and dream dreams with them.
Yeah, and just do that.
It's like, that's how she got business.
You're great, yeah.
She just got more and more sales because she was so good at it. Even though that time was being squashed, she still managed to make the company work on that.
Yeah.
But it was down to her to do all the paperwork. I said, well, how much are you bringing in? It's like, well, you could employ somebody 3 days a week to start with immediately,
Yeah. Cool.
So that was a transformation just with an individual. When it's in teams or even in relationships, in a relationship situation, the woman I was chatting stuff through, her sage was a lot lower than her husband's, and her lover and jester were really a lot higher than his. So I said, let me guess. So when you are halfway through a Saturday, and there's a point at which you're starting to say to him, come on, let's just get out and play, let's just have some fun. And he's saying, no, there's still some things I need to set right, and I still haven't done this, and I still haven't achieved that, and I'm not clear about this, and I'm still planning our holiday, or whatever it is. Yeah, it happens all the time. So he's got to fill his quota of sage before he allows himself to go into that, and his need for jester and lover just isn't as strong. So I said, you're going to have to live with it. He doesn't need as much connection as you do. So you live with it or you don't, but acknowledge it. And now that she sees that in him, she's able to communicate to him on that level and sometimes persuade him, okay, well, look, I know you want to do all these three things. If you just did one, how would you feel? Which is the most important one? So if you just did that for the next hour, how about then at 4 o'clock, not much of our Saturday left, but at least we've got some time. Are you happy to watch a movie together, And those dynamics immediately become apparent just from a simple archetype profile.
So, and to take it on a bit of a tangent here, but related to what you just said, would you say that archetypes can become apparent not just in a person, and can be strong not just in a person, but in a community as well? So like a company might be an example, but also a neighborhood, for example.
Yeah.
Is that something that you've noticed in places? And also, like, not only how does it affect, say, a neighborhood or any community of people to have certain archetypes be strong and weak, but how does it affect how individuals interact with those groups?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot there that you can unpack, but one of the things that as I'm building the data through the app itself, we're going to start looking at things first of all from a global perspective, which countries are stronger with certain archetypes. And some I think are fairly obvious, but then when it comes down to what's regional, it's even more important. We don't have a way of dividing that up at the moment, but that's what we want to be able to do.
Cool. So, like, I mean, I'm going to try not to say anything too
disparaging.
Disparaging, yeah, that's the word I was looking for here. But, Germans maybe strong on the sage, let's say, and maybe French, I'm guessing, might be fairly strong on the lover.
Mais oui.
And then, I don't know, I'm trying to think of some other sort of innocuous examples, but I guess, say, Americans may be fairly strong on the Joker, for example.
Okay, so America's so big. I mean, their
like
population is the size of
Europe.
Europe. Yeah. So, and you've got so many diverse different types going on there. But there will be places where, New York has got much more of that hard warrior. Don't give a stuff about people. We're just business, get it done, etc., etc. Get it finished, get it done. So that's kind of warrior dominating with sage backing it up. Yeah. Whereas if you head over to the opposite coast, you've got a lot more of the kind of free spirit. So
LA is probably way more mystic.
Way more mystic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, where do all of the dreams and myths come out?
Yeah.
Hollywood is creating them, pushing them out. They're stories, So they're storytelling. Whereas over in New York, they're counting the beans, and passionately backing up
And you've got Silicon
vision
Valley
that
where
way.
they're dreaming up the new tech, and kind of. That's almost so kind of like halfway between the two. Almost, it's like business. Right?
Yeah, so the archetypes must work together in order to be effective, and so you cannot have just one of them succeeding. They cannot. You can only work when you have a team.
Are there archetypes that don't work well together? Like, is it possible to have a combination of archetypes where, like, these two archetypes are actually shooting each other down, kind of? Like, I don't know, let's say you're, like, to give a good example of one person, let's say you're, like, really lover and really warrior, but then that ends up, say, coming across to people as, like, you're really aggressively social, and like you seem to kind of just get involved in everyone's business in a way that's actually quite awkward. Like,
absolutely, and this is where the archetype profile will reveal that before you've met the person. If you see those two as strong, you'll say they're passionate. Okay, well, how does that work for them, and how does that work against them? How does that affect their relationships? And so, yeah, absolutely. And so you'll get dynamics, especially, say, between if somebody's really strong with warrior and somebody's really strong with mystic, they have to work to respect each other, because naturally they won't. The mystic will just say, you're just such a blunt instrument, you warrior. You're just going to bash everything through, and you think that's the way to get stuff done, Whereas actually, I can imagine and dream, because I'm transcending up to a different level, and I'm able to see something in a totally different light, and you're almost laughing at, you don't need to expend all that energy, because I've got a laser and you're working with a blunt saw, Yes, you'll get it done, and a lot of people will get hurt in the process, whereas I've got to find a way of dealing with something because I'm operating at a higher level, So there's that, and the warrior looks back and just goes, you're a dreamer, you're woolly, you're nebulous, you're just always head in the clouds, So there's those dynamics, but again, between the lover and the sage, you'll get similar sort of dynamics as well. It's like the lover's wanting to connect, and the sage is wanting to calculate. And so you got those interesting
and
dynamics.
then, of course, like with the sovereign and the jester, where the sovereign is trying to give orders, the jester's just taking the piss out of him.
Yeah, because the jester is the first one to break the rules and have no respect for boundaries. So that's an interesting one. But the sovereign, if they're wise, will give the jester a certain amount of room. And so in the old stories, the old medieval courts, the only person who could insult the king and not lose their head was the jester.
Oh yeah, literally. It was
Quite
his
literally.
job, yeah.
It was his job, was to poke fun at everything, including the king.
And again, it's fascinating that was an integral court function.
Yes.
To go back to kind of what I was saying, well, why do we have to have comedy? Why is it considered so valuable? Comedians are so popular. Yeah. And the court jester was there to mock the king.
Yeah, absolutely. And a wise king will keep employing them. So it's an important part of the balance. You'll also see that the sovereign then utilizes other archetypes. They'll usually go to the warrior and the sage in order to get stuff done. But if they're in a crisis and that's not working, they'll then turn to the mystic. And so you see this in all sorts of situations where, it's slightly different with Lord of the Rings, where Aragorn, initially Strider, finds his old name as Aragorn, he's rising up as a king. But you see the different dynamics between the kings who will accept Gandalf's word and those who dismiss him. And it's interesting that the one who rose into power, into destiny, was the one who sided with the mystic. Whereas the other two kings, the steward and the king, who sort of had a harder time with him, were much more about, keeping order, keeping tradition, and whereas only so much room we can give this mystical character, and the one who did lasted longer than the other. But it was Aragorn who opened his heart to Gandalf, and from that was promoted in a sense.
It's fascinating to continue the kind of conversation about Lord of the Rings. It's really integral in it that you've got Gandalf, this like magical power, who still needs to enlist the help of ordinary men and in order to get things done. Even though there's that scene in the third one where he rides out on his horse and pretty much scares all of the Nazgul away just by shining his staff at them. And in the end he's able to call the eagles and get them away. but you don't get. There's no story. For one thing, if I suppose the mystic just
comes in and changes the world.
Yeah.
Actually, I suppose part of the point is that that's impossible.
Yes, and if they did, in a sense, it wouldn't be right, because and this is an interesting thing to bring into this, is that there are principles that also apply through life as well, and there's all sorts of interesting dynamics where you see people trying to work against principles that are built into ways of life. That every society will elevate some of these archetypes and go through periods of elevating them a little bit too much.
Can you give any examples of that?
So there'll be some cultures where the witch doctor is ruling the roost.
Yeah. Or I guess you can
doesn't end well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or another great one is sort of like why there's never really been a true warrior society that's ever lasted that long. And everyone's like, oh, but Sparta. And it's like, yeah, what happened to Sparta? They lost a couple of battles. Yeah. You know, when your whole society is based around warriors and you lose a bunch of battles, like, you know,
you're gone.
You're done for, you know.
So there wasn't that wisdom to actually say, we can't throw all our resources into this situation. So, oh yeah, but they died with honor. Yeah, but they died.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
got not just a few individuals, an entire, race. I mean, it was
the whole ruling class, would ride to their death, and then it's like, we fulfilled like the principles of our society. It's like, yeah, but now your society is over.
Yeah, and at cost, because they used to kill their infants if they saw them as being slightly weak.
Yeah, and they also set up their entire economy so that there would be a massive slave revolt every 10 years, so they could fight against loads of slaves every 10 years.
Yeah, so so everyone goes too far, or is in danger of going too far, and yet, if we look at any culture from an archetypal point of view, and it's interesting when you look at the spiral dynamics model of societies going through different phases.
Can of worms
it is that
dynamics.
deserves a whole extra thing. You have to look at that as multiple episodes. But if you're familiar with it, and if you're not, get familiar with it, because it's you do see certain archetypal characters are kind of elevated at each one of those times. It's either more, it always swings from one level to another to another to another. It's more me-centric or we-centric. Me-centric, we-centric, me-centric, we-centric. And we will, as societies, we mature through these levels. And so for some of them, the warrior will be the dominant archetype. For others, it will be more of the order of the blue level, where you've got structure and you've got order, the sovereign and the sage setting the rules, and it's rule-based, and there is a right way to do things, and this is it. But then certain individuals start breaking out from that with more of a me-centric, mystical kind of approach, which innovates and breaks through to another level. And so there's all sorts of levels, and it's interesting to see where we are at the moment, where the world has got all these things together. There are some cultures where the warrior is dominant. There's other cultures where structure and order and enforced law is the way that it goes. I mean, the communist system is enforcing that more than anything, but then you can say, well, yeah, but capitalism in a way enforces its own rules as well.
Although you could kind of see it as especially the really totalitarian sort of Joseph Stalin, Chairman Mao is kind of the too much. It's the overinflated stage of the sovereign, where your sovereign gets way too sovereign and starts controlling everything and everyone and destroying everyone that disagrees with him and trying to dictate all of life.
So if it's not balanced with the other states, so if there's no lover going on in there, it's just right out of the pile, then there is a danger of the sovereign being too strong. But the particular thing is when the needs of the individual are not being met. When their needs are not being met, they will do more of who they are in order to get things to happen.
Ooh. So within that framework, what would your thoughts be on the emergence of counterculture in the 1960s and, say, the hippie movement? All right. 3, 2, 1. We're back. Yeah. So my question was, sort of looking at through the lens of kind of societies go through kind of stages of emphasizing one or another of the archetypes, how would you sort of analyze, what would your sort of breakdown be of, let's just say, like the hippie movement in the 60s, and actually a lot of it really happened in the 70s, to be honest, but and sort of that like emergence of counterculture out of 1950s American culture?
So in some ways, the spiral dynamics model is probably a better way of looking at it, because it pulls different energies together in a slightly different way. But from an archetypal point of view, what we saw in the 50s was that there was this move back to the sage, where it was science was everything. It was almost like, it was a funny version of the Enlightenment, when it was science now has the future in its hands. And so the space race had started. And it was all to do with appliances, and there was now money coming back after Britain was virtually bankrupt in the war. The States came and rescued the UK. We were still paying back those debts until about a decade ago, and we were kind of just, every penny during the war years was going into the war effort, and nobody had anything. And so in the 50s, money started coming back. Industry was revitalized with a new level of technology. Interestingly, that the war itself demanded that technology actually advanced for war purposes, and so money was put into researching. And then actually in the 50s, Joe Bloggs was actually benefiting from some of those advances in technology, because now they could become commercially available. So suddenly there was this step forward, and it's like, oh, this is the engineers that have helped us now to improve our quality of life. And now machines are doing a lot of stuff for us that we used to have, horses and all this old stuff, or we were doing by hand ourselves. And now we've got a lot of machines doing stuff. And the factories were pushed into, because of the war effort, factories were set up in order to build munitions. And then you got all these factories. And so how do we do something with that in order to produce goods for people cheaper than ever before? Because these whole, where they had to mass produce munitions in the war, well, then they learned how to mass produce, well, kind of anything. So out comes this massive output. People have started to get back to their jobs, back to making money, lifts up, but science is seen to be the thing. So the boffins were the ones elevated by society, who would appear in the papers, and they were emotionally not that intelligent, but their IQ was really strong, and so they were given the big jobs, and they would start appearing on talk shows and all the rest. So the sages had their heyday. But there's only so much of that society can tolerate, and so halfway through the 60s, you then start getting these guys going, yeah, but you can't reduce our entire lives down to these measurable facts. And and so, you can't reduce everything down by these scientific things. And there's this struggle in society today between the scientists and the spiritual guys. One is the realm of what you can measure, but as soon as you're dealing with powers that you can't measure, the scientists get nervous and either say it doesn't exist, because you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. It's kind of what some people will say, Dawkins included. If I can't measure it, it doesn't exist, and it doesn't need to come into my thinking, my equation. And then you've got those guys looking back and just saying, we've transcended, and we transform our lives because of it. Up to you whether you partake of this, but we wish you could be a part of that. So the mystics kind of had their day, but that's now the mystics. There's a big surge of mysticism. The New Age movement, which, yes, it was involved in the 60s, but the 60s was just as much a love movement of people connecting with people. We're not all machines. This mechanization could potentially be going too far, fellas. Let's start thinking about people. So communes started developing, where they would, drop out of the system, because the system was still quite strong. And so you started seeing this emergence of the lover would be very strong. The whole ecological thing was tied up with the community. So you'd have a layer of mysticism, but actually it was driven through a desire to connect. Connect with people, and for some of them connect with a higher plane as well. And so that kind of broke out from the old model. Now, you then began to see the warrior return in the 80s. So you had
heavy metal.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, the music reflected this. So in the 60s, it was all strummy, nicey. I could do some. And then by the time the 80s came around, of course, music goes in all sorts of directions, but there was a much stronger and a harder edge coming in. And the types of stuff that people were singing. So heavy metal comes in, and
Punk rock.
half of their punk was just a kind of an explosion of rebellion.
Even like techno is a lot more of the kind of like sort of formulaic, but also like a sort of downbeat and like hard edged kind of music.
Yeah. So you'll see it reflected in all sorts of music types as well, which is, you can almost sum up every band with which are their strongest archetypes. Every boy band I love is super duper strong,
Yeah.
But usually when you start reading the interviews, you'll see this one's a bit more sage-like, and this one's a bit more mystic, dreamy-like, and this one's, you sort of take that,
Yeah.
And so you've got this emergence taking place of community and ecology through the 60s in particular. But even then there was a backlash against that as it dwindled during the 70s, of course, but then in the 80s you've got much stronger. The business drive was the big thing. And Thatcher starts coming in with there is no society, just a collection of individuals, so it swung back to the I, not the we. And then the warrior is coming in, and big business is beginning to come in again and dominate. Now, there were always times and places with Rockefeller and Ford and others who did big business things before, but the whole of society was then perpetuating this new thing in the 80s, which was just, make it happen, and it's power dressing and power ties and power this and power lunches and power naps. Power everything.
Yeah.
But not in that ecological sense.
Yeah.
I suppose this is really the era that now business has transcended nationality as well, right?
Yes.
It's like business is now the super entity of people.
Yeah, and IBM's gross national product was a national product. It was bigger than some countries, by that time. Lots of countries actually. And so so you had sovereigns over businesses that had more influence and power than sovereigns over geographical territories, and we've seen that dilute even further and further and further. The geographical borders, this is why politicians are having such a difficult time, is that the politicians no longer have the control that they used to. It used to be that your territory, that was a wall. You could control anything that went across that, whereas now with the web and all the rest, it's just like it's there, and now this is a secondary function, if not tertiary, if not quaternary. I mean, it's like way down the pecking order is this idea of a geographic border now.
So what do you make of what's going on in the world, certainly in the last, say, 3 years, let's say kind of post-Trump and post-Brexit? Like, what's this kind of retribalization and the sort of connecting back to certain ideas of nationality and boundaries and walls, and the kind of rejection of that global, almost business sense, I think.
So there's good and bad in that. It's not, I don't agree with all those guys who just say it's all a bad thing. Because actually
it's more interesting than
it is more interesting because it has to do with identity. And to me, the archetypes and identity are so closely wrapped up. There are levels of identity deeper than archetypes, but the archetypes are a very strong expression of who you are and who you see yourself to be and who other people see you to be. So it's how you identify yourself as an individual. But then from a nationalistic point of view, those guys who will stand up and start talking about stuff that is related to the identity of the nation and starts putting that on the map, they are likely to get higher levels of support than somebody who just comes along and says, oh, we're just a great big global community and it's just all wonderful that we're doing this and that, and we're here to serve the world and all the rest. And there should be a balance here. This is where the sovereign has to have the wisdom to say where there are boundaries and where actually we can keep them open. Where do we define our borders and where do we keep borders open? And there's a real wisdom that has to be implemented. I wouldn't like the job of any of these current politicians who have to make decisions about certain things. There's certain things I agree with, certain things I definitely don't agree with that are taking place in every country. But you'll see that very often it's the balance between the individual and how much they reflect the the current sort of zeitgeist of the community, and that could be a community of a town, or it could be an entire nation, and whether they're tapping into that. And all they need is the majority of them to tick the box, you know. But if they sum that up and they personify that themselves, if they speak that language, then they can carry a whole nation with them. So Luther King did it with I Have a Dream, and he strenuously worked against the violent factions within his movement who wanted to bring a violent solution, as Malcolm X did, against the established order. You know, you could say it was justified, but Luther King said, it may be justified, but it's not the way. And we've got to think about the life of the other side. So his dream was white and black all together, singing the same song, you know? And so he presented that as the vision, not the black guys finally have their day. And more power to them, I say, and doesn't mean that we wipe out any other community or attack any other community. And just as with Mandela, he had the same situation, you know, walking away from the prison gates. Do I choose in this moment to forgive those horrendous whiteys who've done this horrible stuff to me personally, taken 25 years of my life, you know? Or do I forgive? And he had that choice to make at that time. So he was acting as sovereign in a way, but he's also strong with the other archetypes and willing to spread love, willing to spread harmony, willing to keep the vision of the future. And so he had a good mix. He was also sage enough to approach things. You know, he saw his whole prison years as preparation time, not stolen years. You know, he was sage enough to take away the emotion from it and just say, actually, this could be to the salvation of the nation. You know, if I stay my course and if I'm true to the vision. So there's that was a mix of things going on there.
Yeah. So do you think people make political and sort of community decisions? Do you think their decision making is influenced greatly by the presence at a given moment of sort of, and the strength of the archetypes that they have going on?
It's a major influence, and you'll find that the people who are being elevated into positions of power just have that resonance. So if the nation's beginning to feel frustrated, like something needs to happen, then the person who is speaking that voice of the archetype is necessary. So that something that needs to happen could be an ecological message, it could be a community message, or it could be a warrior message. And if they capture that moment, they will then be able to go leaps and bounds into the future. And this can be done positively and negatively. There are dictators who've risen on the back of the discontent of any people group. And as long as they are speaking a word that will give them a vision of a better future, it's almost like whatever means they give them, they will accept. But especially if they tap into it and they show that, well, then the warrior is the one that needs to make this happen, or, you know, whatever it might be. There's always got to be, if there's any making it happen, there's always got to be a sense that the warrior's in there somewhere. But some will do it more through the inspiration of the dream, Martin Luther style. Some will do it more through the, guys, we've got to punch our way out of this, you know.
What would you make of the fact that Ukraine has recently elected a comedian, a literal comedian, to president who hasn't really made any policy proposals? He's just made fun of his opponents.
Well, it's a joke, isn't it? And these guys do like to box outside the think. It's fascinating on so many levels, and I don't know the depths of this guy. I haven't studied him, etc. But it is actually a wonderful case in point that actually sometimes nothing else seems to be working. And what you'll find is that quite often, well, that sovereign thing hasn't worked, of trying to enforce boundaries. The warrior thing hasn't worked. They've been battling it out for 20 years and nobody's winning. The sage thing hasn't worked because nobody's been able to sort of calculate how to solve this riddle. And then, you know, the mystic thing, I don't know, there all seem to be dreamers who don't seem to make anything happen. The lover, well, we've tried reaching out and negotiating and that's fallen apart. blow it. Let's just have a party and let's just show how ridiculous this whole thing is. And I think
it makes a lot of sense.
And the whole blinking nation agreed.
Yeah.
I feel like even Donald Trump is kind of using that jester energy, even if he's not doing it consciously himself.
Right.
Part of the appeal and his charisma is that he's just so ridiculous,
right,
and out there and so memeable.
Yeah.
And that's something that's so big among his base. Is that, you've got like Reddit's The Donald and all of these like can't stump the Trump videos of him just shutting people down and saying things, and it's like, oh my god, I didn't know this could be done in politics.
He's just bulldozed through, and I think some of the things he's bulldozers were actually probably quite good, but a lot of what he has bulldozed.
Bulldozen.
Bulldozed. That sounds German. We have bulldozed. But he's just smashed through. I mean, America doesn't pay him, so he's not beholden to anybody. He doesn't take a salary. He can just do whatever he wants in a way, and I think there's actually quite a lot of. I think there's been. You can query whether he himself is kind of corrupt because of who he is, but he's not beholden to anybody else, and that's the first time in 200 years in American politics that has been the case. And he's certainly speaking his mind and taking action accordingly. I don't know if I would tick all those same boxes that he ticks, but at the same time, as you say, it's really interesting, and in some ways, he's the president that America needed. That's something to chew on. There's arguments for and against, but in some ways, he's this whole thing about draining the swamp. It's used from both sides, and there seems to be a lot of that he's going through, and I don't know enough about the other guys in the circles, but I've learned not to pay any attention to the media.
What do you think about what's going on here then? Because my sense is that Britain's really just lacking leadership. Like, we can't find anybody who can garner enough of the spirit of the community to stand up and do anything. And so we've got Theresa May, who I'm not particularly fond of, but then at the same time, it's like she's kind of doing the hardest job in the world. And
I'd agree with that.
To it.
And
I don't know who I would want to replace her. And I don't know if anybody does.
There doesn't seem to be anybody who's doing exactly what we were saying earlier, which is understanding the mood of the people and able then to put voice to that, to actually speak a vision of what this can be. I'm still very hopeful that Brexit will go ahead. And whether we like it or not, it's going to go ahead. I'm still actually believing. And I have this sneaky, strange thinking, maybe it's the mystic in me, but I believe even if it gets really tough, that actually out from that situation, we're going to come out. This nation is known for its creativity. Whilst the sovereign has been very strong, there is a constant thing of innovation within this nation. Which has changed the world. We have exported ideas to every nation of the world, for hundreds and hundreds of years, multiple times. We keep reinventing. Darn it, the internet came from a Brit. He was working in Switzerland at the time, but the whole idea of this. Back to this wilderness idea. Sometimes it's the wilderness that we need to go into in order for the new thing to break out. And what happens when the rains finally do hit the wilderness? The whole thing springs up with colour and life that you'd never seen there before. I'm just hopeful that it'll be more lasting. We need to utilise technology in much more productive ways. There's a few people doing some wonderful stuff. It's just sometimes it takes pressure for that diamond to come through. And at the moment, all we can see is the sooty coal. But once the pressure comes down, actually, then the diamond begins to form. And that's when I think we're going to see some really amazing stuff in the next 20, 30 years coming out of this country. And actually, Brexit is just a ploughing of the ground. It doesn't look pretty. It doesn't feel nice. It's a mess.
It's shaking things up.
But if you don't do that, the seed doesn't go into the ground.
It's nice to hear a bit of optimism in a time of so much.
Yeah, you definitely don't hear a lot of people speaking with such with any real certainty. about what's going to happen going forward and about what our fate really is.
So I'm not sure that I'm speaking with certainty, but I am speaking with hope.
I mean, I could
And
maybe
this is
say
where-
confidence
this is
is probably the better word. Certainty
Yeah.
implies knowing, but confidence more implies like...
Yeah, confidence is an interesting word. Confidence comes from confidere, which is to have trust in. Yeah. So when people talk about, I'm going to go to a confidence class, it just basically means you trust yourself, not to be stupid. Trust yourself to do the right thing. Trust yourself that you've got the goods, and you can have confidence with other people. I trust you that you're going to do the right thing, or you're going to do, what's necessary, or you're going to complete the thing that I've asked you to do, or whatever it might be. So its confidence is based in that trust, and I do have a strong sense of that trust. And to me, that springs from hope. So hope is actually the primary power of the mystic, really. They have a picture of a better future. They have an expectation. So fear and hope operate with the same muscle. They both involve expectation. It's just one is an expectation of a bad thing happening, but those same muscles inside our soul, if I can put it that way, scientists won't like that one, but inside your soul, that muscle can be used towards fear, or it can swing towards hope, but it's the same mechanism. Yeah. And so if you have an expectation of a good thing, it's called hope. And if you have an expectation of a bad thing, it's called fear. Neither of them have happened yet. Yeah. So that's the dynamic there. The mystic is able to spark that hope and turn it into something that people believe in. And the mystic will just say, just believe. And the sage will go, just you airhead, you know, here's the facts. But the mystic will say, only believe, just believe.
So could you say in a way that sort of Remain was a bit like Sage? Like, no, look at the facts. It's going to be bad for the economy. It's going to result in these bad things. Like, don't do it. Look at the facts. And then Brexit was a bit mystic.
We believe
kind of
in
like,
it, yeah.
You know, like,
you could
take
see it
back
that way.
Control. Think about it. We're going to be back in control. Like, you know, like.
And what could that mean for us? It's like, yeah, what could that mean for us? And so there's two ways of arguing it, but in a sense, that's true. I mean, so it was tapping into a discontent amongst people. And, you know, when you keep hearing things coming out of Brussels that we're no longer allowed to do this, we've got to do it this way. And there's a point at which you just go, who's making these rules? This is ridiculous. And I think that had seeped through enough to the point where people started to say, hold on a second. I don't think that the immigration issue was the deciding factor. I think for some people that was an important factor. I don't think that was what tipped the scales, though. I think it was just some of the things that Brussels is enforcing. And you begin then, you know, you can argue it any way you want economically. Well, we're going to save this. Well, no, that means that we don't get these subsidies. We get and what's it going to cost for this part of the world and that and all that. At the end of the day, the dream will win out because people will be motivated by hope. Every election is won on hope. It's just that it's delivered in slightly different ways. Some will deliver it with factual statistics. Some will deliver it with just force of personality. Whatever it is, people buy into, if I vote for them, we've got a better future. It's hope. However it's delivered, it's hope. And Obama was the first president who actually used it overtly.
Yeah,
a hope for America, you know.
Something archetypal about that, right? It's the ability to tell the story about where we're going.
Yeah, and so it is like we're on the hero's journey, but I can tell you what's coming, and that in itself gives a sense of hope. So definitely,
I think because that's part of the hero's journey, where it's the idea of the guide, the old man, or whoever it is who helps them along, and I think that's what powerful campaigns do. Is they play this like, we will help you, the average person, to realize your destiny, your dreams, whatever is supposed to be right.
Yeah, there's definitely a very strong sense in which in the hero's journey, it's the wise old man who appears, and in a sense, they can be more sage-like or more mystical. I know some people think of a sage as a mystical character. I separate the two, and there's an imperfection of names. Whatever name you give to somebody, it's going to be, you know, it's going to have slightly different connotations. But I think with the warrior, we're pretty clear. With the king or sovereign, it's pretty clear. The sage might be a little bit, to me, they're just the rational brain box type. Some people think of them as a bit mystical. I just say, okay, leave the mystics to the guys who dream and have got that level. And this is back to the thing about, can you divide between knowledge and understanding? If you can, you'll recognize the difference between the sage and the mystic. If to you it's just kind of all the same sort of thing, I can understand why you would confuse the two. But Einstein was an interesting character because he had very strong mystical and sage qualities. In fact, he would say that his mystical qualities were stronger than his sage. He used different language, but almost every breakthrough that he had came through a dream.
This is something fantastic I
cool.
find about like these great scientists. Like Nikola Tesla used to say that he invented by tapping into the cosmic library,
Right.
and he wasn't really inventing himself. He could just see that it was there in this kind of idea space.
It was already there.
Exactly. And then there's another amazing story about the guy who I think discovered the benzene ring in chemistry.
Right.
And he had a dream of a snake hitting its own tail, which is one of the oldest archetypal
Archetypal
Yeah.
images.
Ouroboros,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's cross-cultural, the snake
The
hitting
Jung
its tail.
and
Yeah.
You see people with tattoos with it, and yet he had this dream of this thing and thought, hang on, maybe...
Could it be?
Yeah, and it was. The
Yeah.
benzene is a ring.
Yeah.
Closed, it's...
Yeah. So it's interesting, and this is why Jung was just, there is this collective unconscious that we can all tap into. So there are ways, and there's non-locality of information comes into quantum understanding. There's stuff out there that anyone can access, and people doing remote viewing, if you've ever studied that. But these guys have been able to do remarkably, stunningly, shockingly accurate stuff through guys who initially were engineers and were just trained in ways of doing remote viewing. And of course, some were better at it than others, but actually almost anybody who could follow these particular processes. And it was controlled through the military initially. It went under various names, but there were these whole projects supported by the military and then by the CIA. That for years people said, they stopped the funding because it didn't work. The CIA doesn't fund anything for 20 years if it doesn't work. and you had these guys who initially were hard military men, and pulling in soldiers who were basically couldn't work on active duty anymore, didn't want to leave the military. So, they're not working with mystical psychic types, but they're able to tap into levels of knowledge and come out with info on things that are the other side of the planet. Describing, drawing, saying, okay, this is here, this is what's going on here, even down to the dimensions of certain things. And some of them have done it at almost a subatomic level as well. They're able to access, and they would say it's psychic. China has a whole program of identifying psychic children and programming them for national benefit. That's been going on for 20 years as well. So there's spooky stuff, but what's the point of all of that?
Yeah.
The point of all that is that the mystic will be open to those sorts of ideas. And if the sage is on board, you can actually work together to generate something quite remarkable, because this life is a lot more mysterious than you might imagine it to be. And if you're just open to it, as Einstein was, as others have been, suddenly, as Einstein said, my gift of imagination has done more for me than my ability to look at the evidence and rationalize, whereas Planck would be looking at the hard evidence and grappling with things that, yes, they don't make sense to my rational, logical mind, but are nevertheless appear to be true from the data.
I think for the last few hundred years, there's been this real tension between perhaps science and religion, for lack of better words for it, and that seems to me you can read that as a tension between almost like sage-likeness and mysticness. And certainly a lot of the scientific camps seem to say religion, spirituality, it's basically a low-resolution idea of what we're trying to do. We've got the better answer for it. You just need us. But my sense, and I really feel like this is something that has been around forever but is picking up steam now, is that people are more interested in the spiritual, religious kind of symbolic ways of expressing existence as well as the scientific. And I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I just think they're almost different languages for explaining the same thing. I mean, like, the example I always use is like, if you imagine I took a lighter and lit the flame, and then I said, so what's that? And you might say, well, it's a fire, and how you describe its properties. And you could say it's hot, it's light. And then you could say, well, kind of, but actually it's an exothermic combustion reaction, and you've got electrons jumping up and down, and by doing that they're releasing photons, and they're causing vibrations in the air particles, and that's what we pick up as heat.
Right.
And then you say, right, but what if you tried to explain to a 5-year-old why they shouldn't put their finger in the fire?
Yeah.
And you're not like, that explanation is too technical,
Yeah.
and it doesn't give them any of the sense of the danger or the sensory presence of the flame. And I think that's science and religion in a nutshell, right? You can understand the world through this very analytical, fragmentary lens that gives you a really good way of understanding it and manipulating it, but it also takes all the magic out of it, and it takes all of the personality out of it. You can't relate to it in the same way.
Yeah.
Whereas you can relate to God, whatever God means to you. You can relate to the stories and the spirits.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. It's really interesting. Just, there's a point at which you get to the paralysis of analysis. There's a point at which is a Luther King term. I'm sure somebody said it before him. But there's also that point where you can remove meaning by trying to break things down into this reductionist sort of way. It's actually, what does the fire mean to you? Is more important, I would say, than what's actually happening there in terms of the combustion and the chemical, reactions and all the rest that are taking place. It's like, well, actually, do I need a fire? If I do, what will that do for me? And that's kind of how I deal with the archetypes. There'll be people who argue one thing or another about, well, but you can't say this and you can't say that. And I say, look, it's just a metaphor. But if you tap into it, it's extraordinarily powerful how much that'll change your behavior. And when you change your behavior, it'll change your results. Take all the mystical stuff out of it. Just look at it as behavioral science. Because I can encourage people to do more of one thing and less of another, and they will see the reasoning, and they will be able to tap into that internal, innate, emotional drive that will lead them down more of that path, because they now recognize that's who they need to be. It's not the skills that we work with, first of all. I don't go around with companies saying, let's up our skills or down our skills. It's like, who are we as people? Because if you need to learn something, as long as there's enough sage there, they will learn it. Yeah. If they need to connect more and come together a lot more with more unity and concern and care for each other, then if they step up into the lover, that's going to happen. Yeah. You don't need to learn that knowledge. It's like emotional intelligence. It's great, but you've kind of got this idea of like trying to teach people the emotional thing. It's like, no, actually you need to feel emotions.
Yeah.
So reading about it in a book is actually really not the best way of conveying emotional intelligence, except to the sages who say, yes, I understand love now. I understand the need.
God, what's this thing I'm feeling?
Yes. The need for, I can label it now and categorize it and put it in a little box and I'll get it out when I need it.
I'll start
of chemicals.
I'll start measuring it every day, and I'll graph it.
And I'll say, yes, and I'll plot my levels of love to see whether they've gone in the right direction, KPIs of love. Yes, it's like,
my average monthly love sort of index has dropped too low. It seems like I should probably break up with my wife.
Or change your behaviors in order to be, it's a funny thing, and yet at the same time I use a measurement system, 0 to 10, how much of the love is in you right now, right at this moment, and what would happen if that increased, or what would happen if you pulled it back a little bit. And you can control that like a little thermostat inside of you. You can do that, and you can do it for any one of those characters, and if you see the need for it, it's just a degree of your maturity as to whether you're going to take that on, or then you say, that's not me. It's like, my identity is found in this place and not in that place. Whereas a leader will always be willing, a mature leader will be willing to do whatever it takes to become who they need to be in order to take the people where they need to go.
So what can people, if they're listening to this, do to start exploring these within themselves?
So, profiling yourself is a great start, and that's why I used to do this on the back of a beer mat. I mean, literally in a pub, I'll be sitting here, I'd say, right, sovereign, warrior, sage, mystic, lover, jester, little line. Okay, so where are you? 0 to 10. How much of the sovereign's in you right now? And as long as they understand the character, and if I just say, that kind of kingly energy, how much of that? Oh, I'm about 4 or 5 at the moment. Oh, give me a number. Okay, 5. And then we'd literally plot them all. And then I would say, okay, so what is it you want? And then we'd say, okay, so what's the profile that you need in order to do that? So we'd literally just scribble it out. And after a 5-minute conversation, they can see where the gap is. And they see, I need to step up in the sage then because I just don't know what I need to know to make this happen. Okay, well then how are you going to go about that? And they plot out, well, I'm going to buy 3 books by the end of the week and I'm going to finish one of them in 2 weeks' time. And okay, that was, whatever it will be. It's like that's learning. Or it might be the warrior they need more of, or with their relationship, it might be more of the lover. It might be that the lover's too strong and they're coming over as a bit of a desperado. It's like, I must connect more with you. And it's just like, I've had enough connection from you. So you've got those overheated states of all of them. So it may be, but you can't really, you can pull back a little bit, but it's easier not to try and pull back an archetype, but to strengthen another one. Yeah. So if you want to pull back on the lover, it's actually stronger to bring in the sage who de-emotionalizes things, who's able to do it. So you build that strength and you get the person to think more rationally about the situation. So if you were that sage at the moment where you weren't emotionally invested in this situation, just step back, look at the bigger picture. These 2 people doing their thing, remove yourself from it. What would you... So there's that approach that people can take. So what I'm saying here is that once you've got your profile, you can begin to see where you are naturally. And then when you start doing that comparison, so you either compare it to your partner, or you can compare it to your job situation and what's demanded of you. So it's like who you are against the demand of the environment or the demand of the job or the demand of the challenge. Why do I keep running away from that challenge? Well, it's just demanding too much of that warrior and I'm not willing to go there, But what if you did? And then so we can explore opportunities and take them that way. So at teamme.app, I produce this little thing online where you get the answer by just banging in a bunch of questions. You just do answer. It's 30 questions, but it takes about 90 seconds and you're done. You press your sign up with Facebook and you're in, add your email. And you get the response of your 2 strongest archetypes. So at that point, now then people will then sometimes follow up. They've got these video courses and all the rest that I've got that they can link off to understand depths of what to do. Because what we haven't discussed, maybe for another time, is how precisely what exactly do you do in order to strengthen the warrior or to strengthen the sage or strengthen the lover? And there's 3 key areas related to language and posture and your focus. And there are things that you can do with each of those areas. If you activate those, you can strengthen that character. And the more you do it, then it's going to build it like the muscles in the gym. So you can build up any one of those characters. But the first thing is getting clear, where are you? If I tell you I need you to go to Timbuktu, the first thing you're going to check is, okay, where am I at the moment? Especially if you're in an aircraft and you're going around. It's like, where am I now? And that's where we always start with any kind of coaching, is getting real, a situational assessment. Where are you actually at the moment? But I do that from an archetypal point of view, and then I look at their goals. And I almost don't care about the environment at that point. It may be an influencing factor, it may be something we consider, but we look at it from those 2 perspectives. And then you've got your map. You can see who you need to become, which I think is a much more powerful way of looking at it than what skills do I need to learn. Skills may be a part of it, but that may not be the part that you need to focus on.
In a way, it's about creating a vision rather than just like a sort of set of like technical specifications, rather than simply being like, oh hey, here's like, make this thing better. Instead it's more like, here's an idea of you that you are going to benefit from. That if you here's a vision of someone you can become, who is going to and who, when you be that person, all of these things that you want resolved will hopefully be improved.
Yeah, it's like your election again. You will vote for yourself if you have given yourself enough hope. You have a vision, a picture of a better future because you've become more. So I'll often say, I'll help you achieve more by helping you become more.
Cool. Yeah. Cool. Anyway, I think we should probably wrap this up because I think we're definitely over that 2-hour mark.
There's one final question I wanted to ask, which is kind of on a similar vein, but if you could say to listeners and really kind of anyone, but especially kind of young people, what about the world and the future do you think they should really understand, or what can they do?
So I think that we need, as a planet, we're always interested in advancement. Mapping very closely to all of my work with the archetypes, not just intellectually, although there is an intellectual framework around it, but more to do with the way in which I see it helping people stabilize, balance, get rid of imbalances, become more effective as individuals. They've done that by going back. So sometimes to advance, we have to turn back. And this is where I would say, or Jung would say, it's kind of we go up. We go up into the established, the overarching stuff that was always over and above us, but it's also within us. And I think that there's a danger. There's a lot of people who are throwing out the rule books at the moment on every level of society. And there's some places where that's wonderful and that's great and we need it to. There's some other areas where some really important principles are actually being thrown out and we are in danger of our wheels falling off. And exactly, we could go into weeks of discussions about in this area, where is it, in that area is it, but I would just say to people that don't just go running after the new and the exciting, especially where we're throwing off old structures, because some of those old structures are actually foundations that if you cut those away, you're going to fall through the floor or further. And some of them are like the fence at the edge of the cliff. And you can jump over that fence or snip it with your wire snippers if you want to, but you might just find yourself falling in a way that you can't. So there are dangers, I think, for us casting off restraint. As one of the old proverbs says, where there is no vision, people cast off restraint. Which comes back to, if there's no dream of a better future, you go, what the hell then? And you start doing whatever the hell you want. And then you suffer because of the hell that you get, because there is this thing called karma.
Wow, and what a note to finish on.
Great. Certainly some top tier advice for hopefully everyone watching.
Thank you. It's been a blast. We've gone all sorts of places. I'm interested to see whether we edit out half of what's in the middle. But it's been delightful, gentlemen.
Cool, yeah.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and we shall see. There may be some chats to come. But,
Indeed be.
I hope so.
Keep watching for those chats here on Technosocial.
Right.